One telegram. That's all it took to incinerate 6 centuries of empire. In August 1914, as Europe descended into the madness of the Great War, Enver Pasha, the 33-year-old Napoleon wannabe with more ambition than sense, made a decision so catastrophically stupid that historians still wince when they write about it. He bet everything on Germany. And when the chips fell, an empire that had survived crusades, plagues, and countless wars didn't just lose. It was erased from the map like a mistake in pencil. Before we dive into this tale of imperial self-destruction, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you love stories where one bad decision changes everything, hit that subscribe button, because history is full of them. Istanbul, August 1914. The city that had once been Constantinople still straddled 2 continents like a magnificent bridge between worlds, but now it teetered on the edge of irrelevance. The Bosphorus glittered in the summer sun, its waters carrying cargo ships that no longer paid quite as much tribute to Ottoman coffers as they once had. The great mosques still called the faithful to prayer 5 times a day, their minarets piercing the sky like fingers pointing accusingly at heaven, as if to ask, "What happened to your chosen empire?" In the sublime Porte, the Grand Vizier's office and seat of Ottoman power, Enver Pasha stood before a map of Europe that looked like it had been drawn by a madman having a particularly violent seizure. Red pins marked German positions, blue pins marked French and British, and somewhere in the middle of this mess, the Ottoman Empire sat like a nervous guest at a dinner party where everyone was about to start throwing punches. Enver was not a tall man, but he carried himself like he'd stolen Napoleon's personality and wore it like an ill-fitting suit. His uniform was immaculate, his mustache waxed to points sharp enough to stab olives, and his eyes held that particular gleam of men who believe their own press releases. At 33, he was the youngest member of the triumvirate that actually ran the empire, along with Talat Pasha and Jamal Pasha. Sultan Mehmed V? That poor old man was basically an ornamental fixture, like an expensive lamp that nobody dared throw out, but that served no practical purpose beyond looking vaguely regal. "The Germans will win this war in 6 weeks, Enver announced to the room, his voice carrying the kind of confidence usually reserved for people who are about to be spectacularly wrong. 6 weeks! And when they do, we'll be sitting at the victor's table, carving up the Russian Caucasus like a roasted lamb." Across the ornate desk sat Grand Vizier Said Halim Pasha, a man whose face had the expression of someone who just watched a child juggling with knives while standing on a cliff's edge. He was an Egyptian prince by birth, educated in Europe, and possessed the kind of diplomatic caution that Enver had apparently left in his other pants. "Enver Bey," said Halim began, using the tone one might use with an enthusiastic puppy that had just urinated on an expensive carpet. "Perhaps we should consider neutrality. The British have been our allies before. The Russians are distracted. Why not let the Europeans exhaust themselves while we—" "While we what?" Enver snapped, slamming his palm on the desk with enough force to make the inkwells jump. "While we sit here like cowards watching history happen around us? The empire needs Lebensraum, breathing room. The Russians have been strangling us for a century. This is our chance to break free, to reclaim our destiny." It was worth noting that Enver had just used the German word Lebensraum while discussing Ottoman destiny, which should have been everyone's first clue that he'd perhaps drunk a bit too deeply from the Teutonic Kool-Aid. In the corner of the room, Cemal Pasha, Minister of the Navy, and a man whose paranoia made him see British spies in every shadow, nodded slowly. "The British did seize our dreadnoughts," he said, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "We paid for those ships, every last gold lira, and Churchill took them for the Royal Navy like we were some colonial backwater he could rob at will." This was actually true. The Ottoman government had commissioned 2 battleships from British shipyards, and the Turkish public had literally donated money to pay for them, including children giving up their allowances. Then, on the eve of war, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty and a man who would later be celebrated as a hero but was currently acting like a maritime thief, had simply confiscated the ships. The outrage in Istanbul had been seismic. "The Germans," Enver continued, sensing an opening, "have offered us an alliance. A real alliance, not the condescending pat on the head we get from the British and French, but a partnership between equals." Said Halim wanted to point out that Germany viewed the Ottomans as equals the way a wolf views sheep as equals, meaning as useful tools that would eventually be devoured. But he held his tongue. The young Turk triumvirate had already made up their minds, and contradicting them was a good way to end up with a mysterious case of sudden death syndrome. What nobody in that room fully understood was that they were all actors in a farce, players in a tragedy written by the incompetent hand of fate and edited by German ambition. And the next act was about to begin with 2 ships that would damn an empire. 3 days later, the SMS Goeben and SMS Breslau steamed into the Dardanelles like party crashers arriving with expensive wine and terrible intentions. These 2 German warships, fleeing from the British Mediterranean fleet, had been given sanctuary by the Ottoman Empire in a move that was technically neutral, but actually as neutral as a getaway driver claiming he was just giving a friend a lift. The ships caused immediate diplomatic chaos. Britain demanded their return. France threatened consequences. Russia sharpened its metaphorical knives. And Germany, ever helpful, suggested a solution so absurd that it actually worked. The Ottomans could simply buy the ships, and everything would be fine. On paper, the transaction looked legitimate. In reality, it was like watching someone buy stolen goods from their burglar and then inviting the burglar to move into their house. The German crews stayed with the ships, now renamed Yavuz Sultan Selim and Medili. They even wore Ottoman naval uniforms, though anyone with functioning eyes could tell that these were Germans playing dress-up, like children putting on their parents' clothes and pretending to be adults. Admiral Wilhelm Souchon, commander of the German Mediterranean Squadron, and a man whose diplomatic skills made a hammer look subtle, became the commander of the Ottoman Navy almost overnight. This was roughly equivalent to letting a fox become chief of security for a henhouse and then being surprised when chickens started disappearing. In September, as the initial German advance into France stalled at the Marne, so much for that 6-week victory prediction, Enver began to panic. He'd tied the empire's fate to German success, and the Germans were currently discovering that invading France was somewhat harder than their confident schedules had suggested. "We need to commit," Enver told his colleagues in a midnight meeting that had all the hallmarks of a decision that would be regretted for generations. "If we wait until the war is over, we'll get nothing. But if we join now, while the outcome is still uncertain, we can negotiate for territory, for respect, for restoration of the empire's glory." Talat Pasha, the interior minister, and a man whose talent for political survival was matched only by his capacity for ruthlessness, stroked his mustache thoughtfully. The Germans are asking us to attack Russia through the Caucasus. They say it will draw Russian troops away from the Eastern Front, relieve pressure on Germany, and allow us to reclaim the lands we lost in the Russo-Turkish wars. "And if we refuse," said Halim asked, already knowing the answer. "Then we become irrelevant," Enver said flatly. "The war will end, the victors will carve up the world, and we'll be left begging for scraps from whichever side wins. This way, at least we have agency. We choose our destiny." What Enver failed to mention, or perhaps failed to understand, which was worse, was that he was choosing the empire's destiny the way a lemming chooses to run off a cliff, enthusiastically, but with catastrophic results. On October 29, 1914, Admiral Souchon took the Ottoman fleet, including his beloved former German warships, on what he described as a training exercise in the Black Sea. The Ottoman government insisted they had no knowledge of what happened next, which was either a lie or proof that Enver had given Germany the keys to the empire and then pretended to be surprised when they drove it off a cliff. The Ottoman fleet under German command bombarded Russian ports along the Black Sea coast. Sevastopol, Odessa, Novorossiysk, ancient cities that had known conquest and siege throughout history, suddenly found themselves under attack from ships flying Ottoman flags, but manned by German crews who were having the kind of morning that starts with, "Hold my beer and watch this." The attack was militarily insignificant. A few ships damaged, some port facilities destroyed, civilian casualties that would barely register in the coming carnage of the Great War. But politically, it was the equivalent of walking into a bar, slapping the biggest man in the room, and then acting shocked when he broke your jaw. Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire on November 2nd. Britain and France followed on November 5th, like friends backing up their buddy in the bar fight that the Ottomans had so foolishly started. In the Sublime Porte, as declarations of war arrived like death notices, Said Halim Pasha looked at Enver with the expression of a man watching his house burn down because someone had tried to kill a spider with a flamethrower. "Well," the Grand Vizier said, with the kind of calm that comes from accepting catastrophe, "I suppose we're committed now." Enver, for his part, was ecstatic. "We're making history," he proclaimed, apparently unaware that they were indeed making history, but the kind that gets taught as a cautionary tale rather than a triumph. What nobody in that room realized, what nobody could fully grasp in that moment, was that they hadn't just joined a war. They'd signed the empire's death warrant. The Ottoman Empire had survived for 600 years through a combination of military might, administrative genius, and knowing when to avoid fights it couldn't win. Enver Pasha had just thrown all of that wisdom out the window. And the worst part, the truly, historically, catastrophically absurd part, the real mistake hadn't even happened yet. The winter of 1914 descended on eastern Anatolia like a vengeful god with a grudge and a weather machine. Snow fell in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to arm's length. Temperatures plummeted to 20, 30, even 40 degrees below 0 Celsius, the kind of cold that turned spit into ice before it hit the ground and made men's beards freeze to their faces. And into this frozen hell, Enver Pasha decided to march an army. Not just any army, mind you, but the Third Army, 95,000 men, many of them conscripts who'd been farmers and shopkeepers, just months before, now dressed in uniforms that were laughably inadequate for the conditions they were about to face. Most wore thin cotton uniforms and shoes that fell apart in the snow. Their rifles froze. Their water froze. Their hope, one imagines, froze somewhere around the third day of the march. Enver had studied military history, which was unfortunate because he'd apparently studied only the exciting parts and skipped the chapters titled, "Don't Do This, You Absolute Moron." He'd read about Hannibal crossing the Alps and Napoleon's campaigns, and had somehow concluded that what worked for military geniuses in completely different contexts would definitely work for him in the Caucasus Mountains in the middle of winter. In his defense, Enver's plan looked brilliant on paper. He would lead the Third Army through the mountains in a surprise flanking maneuver, catch the Russian forces at Sarıkamış off guard, and deliver a crushing blow that would vindicate his decision to enter the war. The Russians would never expect an attack through mountain passes in December. Why would they? Because it was suicide dressed up as strategy. On December 22, 1914, Enver personally took command of the Third Army, overriding the objections of experienced officers who had actually fought in winter conditions and knew that mountains plus snow plus an army equals disaster. But Enver had watched too many of his own fantasies play out in his head and had begun to believe them. "We will be the hammer that strikes Russia from an unexpected direction," he announced to his officers. Standing before a map that made the operation look far more feasible than it actually was. The Russian Caucasus army is spread thin, defending multiple fronts. We will concentrate our force at Sarıkamış, break through, and open the road to Baku and beyond. The pan-Turkic peoples of the Caucasus will rise up to join us. We will create a new Turkish empire stretching from Istanbul to the borders of China. His officers exchanged glances that ranged from skeptical to openly horrified, but nobody wanted to be the one to tell the Minister of War that his plan was essentially an elaborate form of military suicide. The march began on December 25th. Christmas Day, which Enver thought was poetically appropriate, but which history would remember as the day an army began dying in slow motion. The first day, they lost 200 men to frostbite. The second day, 500 more. By the third day, soldiers were falling where they stood, their bodies freezing so quickly that they remained upright in the snow like macabre statues pointing toward a destination they'd never reach. The mountain passes that looked like convenient routes on Enver's maps turned out to be narrow death traps where pack animals lost their footing and tumbled into ravines, taking supplies and ammunition with them. The horses died first, then the mules, then the men started eating the frozen carcasses because the supply lines had collapsed somewhere around day 4. Commanders sent desperate messages back to headquarters. Men dying by the hundreds cannot continue. Enver's response was essentially, "Stop being dramatic and keep marching." He'd committed to this course of action, and by God, commitment meant something, even if what it meant was committing genocide against your own army. By December 29th, when the Third Army finally staggered into position to attack Sarıkamış, they'd lost 30,000 men without firing a shot. 30,000. Not to Russian bullets or artillery, but to cold, exhaustion, starvation, and the hubris of one man who thought he could rewrite the laws of physics and climate through sheer force of will. And then they attacked. The Battle of Sarıkamış began on December 29th and immediately went wrong in the way that things go wrong when you've already done everything possible to ensure failure. The Ottoman forces were exhausted, frozen, starving, and facing Russian defenders who were well supplied, well rested, and fighting from defensive positions in a city rather than dying in snowdrifts. The Russians, under General Yudenich, a man whose military competence was inversely proportional to Enver's, had anticipated exactly this kind of foolishness. They'd positioned their forces to channel the Ottoman attack into killing zones where machine guns and artillery could massacre the advancing troops with industrial efficiency. Ottoman soldiers, many of whom could barely hold their rifles with frostbitten hands, charged Russian positions with the kind of bravery that deserves to be celebrated and the kind of tactical stupidity that deserves to be used as a teaching tool in military academies under the heading Things Not to Do Ever. They died in waves. Machine gun fire cut them down like wheat before a scythe. Artillery shells exploded in the packed snow, sending up geysers of ice and blood and body parts. And still, Enver ordered them forward, standing safely behind the lines, moving pins on maps while real men died turning his fantasy into a nightmare. The battle raged for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of frozen hell where men fought not just the Russians, but the cold, the hunger, the despair. Ottoman soldiers would take a position at dawn and be frozen corpses by dusk. Russian counterattacks swept through Ottoman lines like wolves through sheep, and there was nowhere to retreat to except more snow, more cold, more death. By January 5, 1915, what remained of the Third Army was in full retreat, or rather, full collapse. Military retreat implies organization, order, a fighting withdrawal. This was a rout, a stampede of freezing, starving men desperately trying to escape the trap that Enver had marched them into. The Russians pursued relentlessly, not because they were particularly bloodthirsty, but because allowing a defeated army to regroup would be military malpractice. They harried the Ottoman retreat, picked off stragglers, and watched as winter did most of their killing for them. When the survivors finally staggered back to Ottoman-held territory in late January, the accounting began. Of the 95,000 men who'd marched into the Caucasus Mountains, fewer than 18,000 returned. 77,000 men gone. Most died in the retreat, freezing to death in the mountains they'd conquered with such difficulty and lost with such speed. 77,000. To put that in perspective, that's more than twice the number of Americans who died in Vietnam, and it happened in less than 6 weeks, in an operation that achieved literally nothing except proving that mountains in winter will kill you if you give them the chance. When news of the disaster reached Istanbul, Enver did what any great military leader would do when faced with catastrophic failure resulting from his own incompetence. He blamed everyone except himself. The soldiers were insufficiently motivated, he told a stunned cabinet. The officers failed to execute the plan properly. The Russians fought with barbaric desperation. The weather was unseasonably cold. Said Halim Pasha, who had watched this entire debacle unfold with the grim satisfaction of a man who'd predicted disaster and been proven right, finally found his courage. "Enver Bey," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass, "you marched 95,000 men into the Caucasus in winter. What did you expect? Did you think the mountains would part for you? That winter would take a holiday?" Enver's face flushed red. "I expected Ottoman soldiers to fight like Ottoman soldiers. Our ancestors conquered half the world. We let weather stop us?" "Our ancestors," Jemal Pasha interjected quietly, "were not stupid enough to fight winter in Russia simultaneously." The room fell silent. It was one thing to think Enver was an idiot. It was quite another to say it out loud while he still controlled the military. But the damage was done, and not just to Enver's pride. The Third Army had been annihilated. The Eastern Front was now vulnerable, and perhaps worst of all, the Armenians of eastern Anatolia, who'd been treated with suspicion even before the war, were now viewed by the Ottoman government as potential collaborators with Russia, a perception that would lead to horrors that made Sarıkamış look like a dress rehearsal for genocide. Enver, however, had a remarkable talent for moving forward without learning from the past. Sarıkamış hadn't taught him caution. It had taught him that he needed scapegoats. "The Armenians," he said, his voice taking on a darker tone, "cannot be trusted. They welcomed the Russian advance. They sabotaged our supply lines. They are a fifth column in our midst." This was largely false, but facts had never been Enver's strong suit. What was true was that some Armenians had indeed fought on the Russian side, as had some Turks, Kurds, and every other ethnic group that found itself on the wrong side of someone's imperial ambitions. War is complicated that way. But Enver needed someone to blame for Sarıkamış, and the Armenians were convenient. What followed would be one of the great crimes of the 20th century, but that's a horror story for another time. For now, the empire had bigger problems. The British were coming. In London, Winston Churchill, the same man who had stolen the Ottoman dreadnoughts, looked at a map of the Ottoman Empire and saw opportunity. The Turks had proven themselves incompetent in the Caucasus. They were overextended, undersupplied, and led by morons. Surely, Churchill reasoned, a quick strike at the Dardanelles, the narrow strait that connected the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, could knock the Ottomans out of the war entirely. "We'll force the straits with our navy," Churchill explained to the British War Cabinet, pointing at the Dardanelles with the confidence of a man who'd never actually tried to sail warships through a narrow, heavily fortified strait, defended by mines, artillery, and desperate men with nothing to lose. "Once we control the Dardanelles, we can threaten Constantinople directly. The Ottoman government will collapse, will open a supply route to Russia, and will have won the war in the east without firing a shot on the Western Front." It was a brilliant plan, assuming everything went perfectly, and the Ottomans continued to be as incompetent as they'd been at Sarıkamış. Spoiler alert, they weren't. On February 19, 1915, British and French warships began bombarding the outer forts of the Dardanelles. The Ottoman defenders, led by German advisors who actually knew what they were doing, watched the bombardment with grim satisfaction. Every shell the British fired revealed their position. Every attack showed their strategy. And with each passing day, the Ottomans strengthened their defenses, laid more mines, positioned more artillery, and prepared for what would become one of the most legendary defensive stands in military history. The British, meanwhile, kept attacking with a kind of persistent optimism that borders on delusion. Their ships struck mines and sank. Their landing parties were cut down on beaches that offered no cover. And still they came, wave after wave, convinced that one more push would break Ottoman resistance. It wouldn't. But that battle, the disaster at Gallipoli, was still unfolding. And in Istanbul, as winter turned to spring in 1915, Enver Pasha looked at the map of the empire and realized something terrifying. They were losing on every front. The Caucasus was disaster. British forces were advancing through Mesopotamia toward Baghdad. The Suez Canal campaign, another Enver brainchild, had failed miserably when Ottoman forces discovered that attacking across the Sinai Desert in summer was only slightly less suicidal than attacking through the Caucasus in winter. The empire was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, and the transfusion it desperately needed, German victory in Europe, seemed further away with each passing month. Talat Pasha, watching Enver spiral into increasingly desperate strategies, finally pulled him aside after a particularly disastrous cabinet meeting. "We need to consider options," Talat said carefully. "For what happens if Germany doesn't win this war?" Enver looked at him like he'd suggested the earth might be flat. "Germany will win. They must win. If they don't, we're finished." "Yes," Talat agreed, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding, something Enver refused to see. "That's exactly my point." But Enver wasn't listening. He was already planning the next campaign, the next grand strategy, the next opportunity to prove that his decision to enter the war had been correct. Because admitting he'd been wrong meant admitting that he'd doomed an empire for his own vanity. And Enver Pasha was many things: ambitious, delusional, incompetent. But he was not a man who admitted mistakes. Meanwhile, in the trenches of Gallipoli, Ottoman soldiers were writing a different story. While their leadership blundered from one disaster to another, these men, led by a quiet colonel named Mustafa Kemal, who would later become Ataturk, were proving that the empire still had fight left in it. "I don't order you to attack," Kemal told his men at Gallipoli. "I order you to die. In the time it takes us to die, other units and commanders will come and take our place." It was a brutal calculus, but it worked. The Ottomans held Gallipoli not through brilliant strategy, but through sheer bloody-minded determination to die before retreating. They turned beaches into graveyards and made every meter of ground cost the British and Anzacs a price in blood that eventually became too expensive to pay. By December 1915, the British evacuated Gallipoli, having lost over 50,000 dead in an operation that achieved nothing except proving that the Ottomans, when properly led, were still dangerous. But Gallipoli was a defensive victory, and defensive victories don't win wars. They just delay losing them. The empire was dying. It was dying slowly, painfully, bleeding out across multiple fronts, while its leadership squabbled over who to blame and how to spin the disasters into something resembling competence. And the worst part? The absolutely, historically, face-palmingly tragic part. It was about to get so much worse. By 1916, the Ottoman Empire had become what military historians politely call strategically challenged, and what everyone else calls completely screwed. The empire was fighting on 5 fronts simultaneously: the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, the Sinai, Gallipoli until the evacuation, and Arabia, which was roughly 4 fronts more than it could handle. The treasury was empty, the army was exhausted, and Enver Pasha, having learned absolutely nothing from Sarıkamış, was planning new offensives with the enthusiasm of a gambling addict who thinks the next hand will definitely be the one that turns everything around. In the Grand Vizier's office, Said Halim Pasha had developed a nervous tic. Every time someone mentioned a new military operation, his left eye would twitch, as if his body was physically recoiling from the incoming stupidity. "We're going to retake Baghdad," Enver announced in March 1916, pointing at a map where Baghdad was marked with an optimistic Ottoman flag. Despite the fact that British forces under General Townshend had already captured Kut al-Amara and were advancing steadily up the Tigris. "With what army?" Jamal asked, not bothering to hide his skepticism anymore. The triumvirate was fracturing, each member beginning to realize that being on a sinking ship together didn't mean you had to go down holding hands. The Sixth Army, Enver replied. Led by German advisors, the British are overextended. One strong push, and their entire Mesopotamian campaign collapses. What Enver didn't mention, or perhaps didn't understand, was that the British, despite being imperial overlords who'd colonized half the planet through a combination of superior firepower and weaponized tea drinking, actually knew how to conduct military operations. They had supply lines, they had reinforcements. They had basic competence. The Ottomans had enthusiasm and an increasingly delusional war minister. The campaign to retake Baghdad failed before it even really began. Ottoman forces, weakened by years of war and chronic undersupply, couldn't dislodge the British from their positions. Meanwhile, the British, having learned from their Gallipoli disaster, actually prepared properly for desert warfare, which apparently involved bringing sufficient water, ammunition, and common sense. But something interesting happened during the siege of Kut. The British garrison, surrounded and starving, eventually surrendered in April 1916. 13,000 British and Indian soldiers became prisoners of war, which was the largest British military surrender since Yorktown in 1781. Enver was ecstatic. Finally, a victory. Sure, it had cost thousands of Ottoman lives and achieved nothing strategically, but it was something to crow about in the newspapers, something to distract the public from the fact that the empire was losing everywhere else. See? Enver told his colleagues, waving a newspaper that described the victory in glowing terms. The British can be beaten. This proves our strategy is working. Talat Pasha, who'd been watching Enver's delusions with increasing concern, finally snapped. Our strategy? Enver, we don't have a strategy. We have a series of disasters interrupted occasionally by the British making mistakes. That's not victory, that's luck, and luck runs out. The room froze. Talat had just said what everyone was thinking, and the silence that followed was the kind that precedes either enlightenment or violence. Enver's face went through several colors, red, purple, a shade of crimson that suggested imminent cardiac arrest, before he spoke. You dare question my leadership? After Gallipoli? After Kut? Gallipoli was Mustafa Kemal's victory, not yours, Talat shot back, his voice rising. And Kut was won by soldiers starving the British out, not by your brilliant strategy. Every offensive you personally commanded has been a disaster. Sarıkamış killed 77,000 men. The Suez campaign failed. The Caucasus front is a bleeding wound that won't close. And now you want to reconquer Mesopotamia with an army that can barely defend what we already hold? The truth hung in the air like poison gas, and for a moment Enver looked like a man who'd just been slapped awake from a beautiful dream only to find himself in a nightmare. But then his face hardened. Admitting error was weakness, and weakness was death in the vicious politics of the Young Turk regime. Get out, Enver said quietly, his voice carrying more menace than any shout. Get out before I have you arrested for defeatism. Talat left, and with him went any remaining pretense that the triumvirate was united. From that moment forward, it was every man for himself, each trying to position themselves for survival when the empire finally collapsed. And collapse was coming, though not in the way anyone expected. In the Hejaz region of Arabia, a British officer with a talent for guerrilla warfare and a flair for the dramatic was busy turning the Ottoman Empire's southern flank into a smoking ruin. His name was T.E. Lawrence, though history would remember him as Lawrence of Arabia. and he was proving that you didn't need massive armies to wreck an empire. You just needed camels, explosives, and Arab tribesmen who were thoroughly sick of Ottoman rule. Lawrence's strategy was brilliantly simple: blow up the Hejaz Railway. This single rail line was the Ottoman Empire's lifeline to its Arabian territories, carrying supplies, reinforcements, and the taxes that helped fund the war effort. Every time Lawrence destroyed a section of track, he forced the Ottomans to divert troops to guard the railway, troops they desperately needed elsewhere. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and there was nothing the Ottomans could do about it. They couldn't guard every kilometer of track. They couldn't stop tribesmen who knew the desert better than they knew their own mothers. And they couldn't win a guerrilla war when they were already losing conventional wars on 4 other fronts. By mid-1916, the Arab Revolt was in full swing. Sharif Hussein of Mecca had declared independence, raising the flag of Arab nationalism and calling for the end of Ottoman rule. The Ottomans sent an expedition to retake Mecca and Medina, which went about as well as all of Enver's other expeditions, which is to say, it failed miserably and left more Ottoman soldiers dead in the desert. The empire was coming apart at the seams, and the seamstress, in this case Enver and his colleagues, seemed determined to use scissors instead of thread. But here's where the story takes its first truly catastrophic turn, the moment when bad decisions metastasized into generational tragedy. In the summer of 1916, Enver received a telegram from his German allies. The Germans, bogged down in a war of attrition on the Western Front, were getting desperate. They needed the Ottomans to do more, to tie down more Russian forces, to prevent Russia from fully focusing its vast resources on Germany. The telegram was polite but firm. The Ottoman Empire needed to launch a major offensive in the Caucasus, or German support might become less enthusiastic. Enver, still smarting from Talat's accusations and desperate to prove his worth, saw an opportunity. He would launch the offensive Germany wanted. He would redeem Sarıkamış. He would show everyone that he'd been right all along. There was just one problem. He had no army left to do it with. The Third Army was gone, annihilated at Sarıkamış. The Sixth Army was stuck in Mesopotamia. The Fourth Army was fighting in the Sinai. The Second Army was defending Thrace against a potential Bulgarian or Greek invasion. Every unit was committed. Every soldier was already dying somewhere, and there were no reserves. Unless... Enver looked at a map of Anatolia and saw something that had been bothering him since the war began: the Armenians. Over 1 million Armenian Christians living in eastern Anatolia, right in the path of any potential Russian advance. They spoke a different language, practiced a different religion, and, this was the part that haunted Ottoman paranoia, lived in territories that Russia had long claimed as rightfully theirs. What if, Enver thought, the Armenians were the reason the Ottomans kept losing in the Caucasus? What if they were a fifth column, sabotaging Ottoman efforts, aiding Russian advances, waiting to stab the empire in the back? It was nonsense, of course, paranoid, racist nonsense rooted in military failure and the need to blame someone other than himself. But it was the kind of nonsense that desperate men tell themselves when they need to justify the unjustifiable. In April 1915, the Ottoman government had already begun what they called relocations of Armenian populations from the eastern provinces. What actually happened was systematic massacre disguised as deportation. Death marches into the Syrian desert where hundreds of thousands would die of starvation, thirst, and murder at the hands of special units organized specifically for killing. By 1916, the Armenian genocide was in full swing, and historians still argue about who gave the orders and who knew what. But what's clear is that Enver, Talat, and Kemal, the triumvirate that ruled the empire, all knew, all approved, and all share responsibility for what would become one of the 20th century's greatest crimes. Over 1 million Armenians would die between 1915 and 1923. An entire civilization, with its own language, culture, churches, and history stretching back millennia, was nearly erased from Anatolia. And the sick irony? It didn't help the war effort at all. The Russians still advanced, the Ottomans still lost. The only thing the genocide accomplished was staining the empire's final years with a crime so monstrous that it would overshadow everything else about the Ottoman legacy. But in 1916, the full scale of the horror was still unfolding, and the empire had more immediate concerns. The British were advancing in Mesopotamia. The Russians were pushing into eastern Anatolia, and the Germans were getting impatient. Now, here's something that nobody expected, the twist that would change everything. In December 1916, Enver received another telegram from Berlin. But this one wasn't asking for an offensive. This one was asking for something far more dangerous: sabotage. The Germans had a plan, a brilliant, audacious, completely insane plan that would either change the course of the war or blow up in everyone's faces. They wanted the Ottomans to help them spark a revolution in Russia. The idea was simple. Russia was war-weary, its people starving, its soldiers dying by the millions. The Tsar's grip on power was weakening. What if someone gave the Russian revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, all the various flavors of communists and anarchists who wanted to tear down the Russian Empire? What if someone gave them enough money and support to actually succeed? Germany would fund the revolution. The Ottomans would help smuggle revolutionaries and weapons across their borders into Russian territory. And if it worked, Russia would collapse into civil war, withdraw from World War I, and leave Germany free to focus all its might on the Western Front. It was the kind of plan that seems brilliant when you're desperate and idiotic when you look at it in hindsight, which describes pretty much every decision the Central Powers made during the World War I. Enver, incredibly, actually hesitated. Even he could see that trying to destabilize Russia might have unforeseen consequences. Revolutions had a nasty habit of spreading, of jumping borders like wildfires, of consuming everything in their path, including the idiots who started them. But the Germans were insistent, and Enver, ever the German fanboy, eventually agreed. The Ottoman Empire began funneling money and support to Russian revolutionary groups. They helped smuggle agitators across the border. They provided safe houses for Bolshevik organizers. They became, essentially, midwives to the Russian Revolution. And in February 1917, something incredible happened. It worked. The February Revolution toppled the Tsar. Nicholas II, ruler of the largest empire on earth, abdicated his throne and was imprisoned by revolutionaries. Russia descended into chaos, its government paralyzed, its army disintegrating, its people tearing themselves apart over the question of what comes after tyranny. For a brief, shining moment, Enver thought he'd been vindicated. Russia was out of the war. The Caucasus front was collapsing. The gamble had paid off. What he failed to consider was what comes next when you help destroy the world's largest empire. Someone has to fill the power vacuum, and they might not be friendly. The Bolsheviks took power in October 1917, led by Vladimir Lenin, a man whose charisma was matched only by his capacity for ruthless violence and whose ideology would reshape the 20th century in ways that made the Ottoman collapse look like a minor administrative adjustment. Lenin's first major act was to sue for peace with Germany. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, pulled Russia out of World War I and gave Germany everything it wanted: massive territorial concessions, peace on the Eastern Front, and the ability to transfer millions of troops westward for one final desperate push against France and Britain. Enver was thrilled. His gamble had worked. Russia was defeated. The Caucasus territories, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, were there for the taking. The pan-Turkic empire he'd dreamed of was finally within reach. There was just one tiny problem that Enver, in his infinite wisdom, had failed to consider. The Bolsheviks had no intention of staying contained within Russia's borders. Lenin and his fellow revolutionaries believed in world revolution. They weren't fighting to create a new Russian empire. They were fighting to destroy all empires, to spark a global uprising of workers that would sweep away capitalism, monarchy, and every other system they deemed oppressive, including, naturally, the Ottoman Empire. By the summer of 1918, Bolshevik agitators were already working in Ottoman territories, preaching revolution to Turkish workers, Kurdish peasants, and Arab laborers. The same tactics the Ottomans had helped use against the Tsar were now being turned against them. And Enver discovered that revolutions are much less fun when they're happening in your own country. "We need to crush the Bolshevik cells immediately," Enver told an emergency cabinet meeting in July 1918, apparently having forgotten that 6 months earlier he'd been their biggest supporter. "They're poisoning the minds of our workers, turning them against the empire." Talat, who'd been watching this entire fiasco with grim amusement, couldn't resist. Funny how dangerous revolutionaries become when they're targeting you instead of your enemies. Enver glared at him, but said nothing. There was nothing to say. He'd helped unleash chaos, and chaos doesn't check passports before crossing borders. But the Bolshevik threat, while concerning, was still manageable in mid-1918. The real crisis was happening on the Western Front, where Germany's last great offensive was failing. The spring offensive of 1918, Germany's final gamble to win the war before American troops arrived in overwhelming numbers, had started brilliantly. German forces, reinforced by troops from the now quiet Eastern Front, smashed through Allied lines and advanced to within artillery range of Paris. For a few glorious weeks, it looked like Germany might actually win. Then the offensive stalled. The Germans had advanced so fast that their supply lines couldn't keep up. Their troops were exhausted, having fought continuously for months. And the Americans, fresh, well-equipped, and arriving in numbers that made even the most optimistic German planners weep, began to turn the tide. By August 1918, the spring offensive had collapsed. Germany was retreating, and suddenly, after 4 years of war, the unthinkable was becoming inevitable. The Central Powers were going to lose. In Istanbul, as reports of German defeats poured in, Enver finally understood what Talat had been trying to tell him since 1914. They were finished. The empire had bet everything on German victory. They'd burned bridges with Britain, France, and Russia. They'd committed genocide against the Armenians, ensuring that no one in the international community would lift a finger to help them. They'd alienated the Arabs, who were currently busy taking back the Arabian Peninsula with British help. They'd exhausted their army, bankrupted their treasury, and alienated their own population. And for what? For the privilege of going down with the German ship? On September 30th, 1918, Bulgaria, the first of the Central Powers, surrendered. The Allies now had a clear path through the Balkans to strike at Istanbul directly. On October 3rd, Germany sent a telegram to Washington requesting an armistice. The war was over, or would be soon, and Germany had lost. The Ottoman Empire had exactly 1 month left before the Allies came knocking. Enver Pasha, ever the delusional optimist, wanted to fight to the last. "We can defend Istanbul," he told a cabinet meeting where half the ministers were already planning their escape routes. "We can make them pay for every street, every building. We can surrender," Talat interrupted, his voice flat. "We can accept defeat and hope the Allies show mercy, because the alternative is watching Istanbul burn while our remaining soldiers die defending an empire that ceased to exist the moment we joined this cursed war." For once, Enver had no response. The reality of his failure, the magnitude of his mistake, was finally penetrating the armor of his delusions. He destroyed an empire. 6 centuries of Ottoman history ended because he thought himself a military genius and tied the empire's fate to Germany's doomed ambitions. On October 30th, 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros with the Allies. The terms were harsh. The empire would demobilize its military, surrender its remaining territories, and accept Allied occupation of strategic positions, including Istanbul itself. The war was over. The Ottomans had lost, and the butcher's bill was coming due. Over 3 million Ottoman subjects had died during the war. Soldiers, civilians, Armenians murdered in the genocide, Arabs killed in the revolts, Turks who'd starved during the British blockade. 3 million people dead because Enver Pasha had wanted glory and found only catastrophe. But here's where the story takes its sharpest, most unexpected turn. The twist that nobody saw coming, least of all, Enver himself. On November 1st, 1918, the day after the armistice was signed, Enver Pasha fled Istanbul. He didn't stay to face consequences. He didn't accept responsibility. He ran, disguised as a German officer, boarding a German U-boat that smuggled him out of the empire he'd destroyed. He fled to Germany, where he lived in comfortable exile while his country collapsed into occupation and chaos. He watched from safety as the Allies carved up the Ottoman Empire like a Thanksgiving turkey, creating new nations from old provinces and drawing borders with rulers and racism rather than any regard for the people who actually lived there. Syria went to France, Iraq and Palestine went to Britain. Arabia became independent under the Saudis. Greece occupied Smyrna. The Armenians got promises of a homeland that would never materialize. And Turkey itself, the heartland of the empire, was reduced to a rump state, occupied, humiliated, and expected to simply accept its dismemberment. But something happened that Enver, in his exile, couldn't have predicted. The Turkish people who'd followed him into disaster didn't accept defeat. They didn't quietly submit to occupation. Instead, they found a new leader, a better leader, a man who'd proven himself at Gallipoli and understood what Enver never did. That military genius isn't about grand offensives and glorious cavalry charges. It's about not getting your soldiers killed for stupid reasons. Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, father of the Turks, emerged from the Ottoman collapse like a phoenix from ashes. He rallied the remaining Turkish forces, organized resistance against the occupying powers, and fought what would become known as the Turkish War of Independence. In May 1919, Greek forces, encouraged by the Allies, invaded Anatolia, planning to establish Greek control over western Turkey. They advanced confidently, expecting little resistance from the defeated Ottomans. They found Mustafa Kemal instead. The Turkish War of Independence was everything Enver's campaigns weren't: carefully planned, properly supplied, and led by someone who understood that victory comes from not losing rather than from glorious charges into machine gun fire. Kemal fought a guerrilla war when necessary and a conventional war when possible. He united Turkish nationalists, former Ottoman officers, and ordinary people who were sick of foreign occupation. And somehow, impossibly, he won. By 1922, the Turkish forces had driven the Greeks out of Anatolia entirely, culminating in the Great Fire of Smyrna, a tragedy that saw the destruction of one of the Mediterranean's great cities and the flight of hundreds of thousands of Greek and Armenian refugees. In November 1922, the Turkish Grand National Assembly, led by Kemal, officially abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. Sultan Mehmed VI, the man who had sat on the throne while Enver destroyed the empire, fled Istanbul on a British warship, ending over 6 centuries of Ottoman rule, not with a bang, but with a sad old man sneaking out the back door. On October 29, 1923, Mustafa Kemal proclaimed the Republic of Turkey. The Ottoman Empire was dead. Something new, something different had taken its place. And Enver? Where was Enver during this Turkish Renaissance? He was in Central Asia, still chasing his pan-Turkic fantasies, still believing he could recreate the glory he'd destroyed. He'd left Germany for the Soviet Union, briefly worked with the Bolsheviks, then turned against them and joined the Basmachi Revolt, a Muslim insurgency fighting against Soviet control of Central Asia. On August 4, 1922, while Mustafa Kemal was winning the Turkish War of Independence, Enver Pasha was in Tajikistan, leading a cavalry charge against Soviet forces. It was the kind of glorious, stupid, romantic gesture that had defined his entire career. A Soviet machine gunner cut him down. One of the 20th century's most consequential idiots died in a nowhere village, leading a doomed rebellion, still believing he was destined for greatness. He was 40 years old. His body was left where it fell. The Soviets didn't even bother to identify him immediately. When they finally figured out who they'd killed, they considered it good riddance. Now you might be thinking, okay, so Enver was an idiot who destroyed an empire through a series of catastrophically bad decisions. But what was the crazy mistake? The one mistake that ended everything? Here's the thing. It wasn't one mistake. It was a cascade of mistakes, each building on the last, each making the next disaster inevitable. But if we had to pick the single most catastrophic decision, the moment when the empire's fate was sealed, it was this: entering the war at all. Everything else, Sarıkamış, the Armenian genocide, the failed offensives, the alliance with Germany, all of it flowed from that one decision in August 1914 when Enver decided to bet the empire on German victory. The Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. Yes, but sick men can recover. They can rest, rebuild, wait for better times. What they can't do is survive being thrown into a meat grinder and left there for 4 years. Neutrality was an option. It was always an option. Sweden stayed neutral and survived. Spain stayed neutral and survived. The Ottomans could have watched the great powers destroy themselves and emerged intact, perhaps even strengthened by staying out of the conflict. But Enver wanted glory. He wanted to prove the empire was still relevant, still powerful, still capable of playing with the big boys. And that hubris, that desperate need to matter, cost millions of lives and ended 6 centuries of history. The truly tragic part? The part that should make you pause and think about your own leaders and their decisions? Nobody stopped him. The Sultan was powerless. The Grand Vizier was overruled. The military commanders who objected were replaced, and the Turkish people who would pay the ultimate price weren't consulted at all. One man's ego, enabled by a system that gave him too much power and not enough accountability, destroyed an empire. Think about that. Really think about it. Because the lesson of the Ottoman Empire's collapse isn't just about Enver Pasha's incompetence. It's about what happens when leaders prioritize pride over prudence, when ambition overrides wisdom, when the desire to look strong outweighs the courage to admit weakness. Here's a question for you to ponder. Can you think of any modern leaders who've made similar mistakes, prioritizing their own legacy or ego over the well-being of their nation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what parallels you see between Enver's catastrophic decisions and the political landscape we're navigating today. The aftermath of the Ottoman collapse rippled across the world in ways that are still reshaping history a century later. The Middle East that emerged from the Ottoman ruins wasn't born from the desires of the people who lived there. It was drawn by British and French diplomats with rulers and colonial ambitions, creating countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan that had never existed before. They drew straight lines across maps, grouped together ethnic groups that hated each other, separated communities that had lived together for centuries, and called it self-determination, while really meaning we're dividing up your land and you'll thank us for it. The promises made to the Arabs during the war, Lawrence's promises, British promises, all those grand declarations about Arab independence, turned out to be worth less than the paper they were written on. Instead of freedom, they got French and British mandates, which were basically colonialism, wearing a fancy suit and using diplomatic language. Palestine became a British mandate with a twist. The Balfour Declaration had promised it as a homeland for Jewish people, while also promising the Arabs that their rights would be protected. Trying to keep both promises was like trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it while also spraying it with water. You're going to fail, and everyone's going to get burned. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which continues to this day, has its roots in those post-Ottoman decisions. The violence, the suffering, the seemingly endless cycle of revenge and counter-revenge, all of it traces back, in part, to how the Ottoman Empire's collapse was handled. Iraq, cobbled together from 3 Ottoman provinces that had little in common except being conquered by Britain, would spend the next century torn by sectarian violence, coups, dictatorships, and invasions. Saddam Hussein, the Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf Wars, ISIS, all of these tragedies have roots in the artificial state created from Ottoman ruins. Syria, handed to France, would eventually descend into one of the 21st century's most horrific civil wars, with over 500,000 dead and millions more displaced. The Syrian civil war is, in many ways, still fighting over questions left unresolved by the Ottoman collapse. Who gets to define the nation? What happens to minority groups? How do you build a state from the fragments of empire? And Turkey itself? Turkey's story became something remarkable, though not without tremendous cost. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk built the Turkish Republic on the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, and he did so by making radical changes that would have been unthinkable under the sultans. He abolished the caliphate in 1924, ending over 1,000 years of Islamic political authority. He replaced Arabic script with Latin letters. He gave women the right to vote, before many European countries did the same. He secularized the government, banned traditional Ottoman dress, even tried to ban the fez because it represented the old empire he was trying to replace. It was cultural revolution at gunpoint, and it created a modern, secular Turkey that became a regional power. But it also created tensions that still exist today between secular and religious Turks, between those who see Ataturk as a hero and those who see him as someone who tried to erase their Islamic identity, between the vision of Turkey as a Western-oriented democracy and Turkey as an Islamic nation. The Kurdish question, the fact that millions of Kurds live in Turkey but have never had their own state, is another unresolved legacy of the Ottoman collapse. The Kurds were promised independence in the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, but that promise was abandoned in the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. A century later, Kurdish groups are still fighting for autonomy, and the Turkish government is still fighting to prevent it. Every border conflict, every ethnic tension, every religious dispute in the modern Middle East can be traced, at least partially, back to how the Ottoman Empire ended and what replaced it. But here's the truly haunting part, the part that should keep anyone interested in history awake at night. It didn't have to be this way. If Enver had chosen neutrality in 1914, the Ottoman Empire might have survived World War I intact. Would it have eventually fallen anyway? Probably. Empires don't last forever, and the Ottoman system was riddled with problems that neutrality alone couldn't fix. But it might have fallen differently. Gradually, peacefully even, transforming into something new without the catastrophic violence, the genocide, the wars, the displacement of millions. The Middle East might have evolved rather than being shattered and hastily reassembled by colonial powers with their own agendas. Instead, Enver's decision to ally with Germany guaranteed that when the empire fell, it would fall catastrophically, taking millions of lives with it and leaving wounds that still haven't healed a century later. One man's mistake, one terrible decision. And the consequences are still playing out in headlines today. The Syrian civil war, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Turkish-Kurdish tensions, the instability in Iraq, the sectarian violence across the region. History isn't just something that happened in the past. It's the foundation we're all standing on, whether we realize it or not. And the collapse of the Ottoman Empire is part of that foundation, cracks and all. Enver Pasha died believing he was a hero, a visionary who'd fought for Turkish glory and pan-Turkish unity. He never lived to see what his decisions had actually created, a century of chaos, violence, and suffering that made his death in an obscure cavalry charge look almost merciful by comparison. The Ottoman Empire, which had survived the Crusades, the Mongol invasions, the rise and fall of countless European dynasties, which had ruled from Budapest to Baghdad, from Algeria to Azerbaijan, ended not with a glorious last stand, but with a whimper signed away in an armistice by exhausted men who'd run out of soldiers to sacrifice to one man's ambition. Sultan Mehmed V, whose turban-clad portrait we saw at the beginning of this story, died in 1918, just months before the armistice. He'd been sultan for 9 years, but he'd never really ruled. He'd been a figurehead, a symbolic ruler in an empire actually controlled by the Young Turks and their disastrous decisions. His successor, Mehmed VI, would be the last Ottoman sultan. He'd reign for 4 years before fleeing into exile, ending a dynasty that had ruled since 1299. Over 600 years of Ottoman history ended with an old man sneaking onto a British warship in the middle of the night, taking only what he could carry, leaving behind a palace full of treasures and a legacy full of questions. What if Enver had chosen differently? What if the Ottomans had stayed neutral? What if someone had stopped the march to Sarıkamış? What if the Armenian genocide had never happened? What if? History is built on those what-ifs, on the moments when one decision led to catastrophe and another path, not taken, might have led somewhere better. The crazy mistake that ended the Ottoman Empire wasn't really crazy at all. It was perfectly rational from Enver's perspective. He genuinely believed Germany would win, that the empire would gain territory and prestige, that he'd be remembered as the man who restored Ottoman glory. The mistake was that he was wrong. Catastrophically, empire-endingly, million lives costingly, wrong. And nobody could stop him because the system that should have provided checks and balances, the Sultan, the cabinet, the will of the people, had been gutted by the Young Turk Revolution and replaced with a dictatorship of true believers who thought they knew better than everyone else. The lesson? Maybe it's this: be very careful who you give power to. Be even more careful about leaders who promise glory and demand you trust them. And be most careful of all about decisions that look bold and decisive, but are actually just stupid and catastrophic, dressed up in fancy uniforms. Enver Pasha looked like a hero, young, ambitious, decisive, confident. He talked like a hero, using the language of national greatness and historical destiny. He acted like a hero, making grand gestures and bold decisions. But heroes don't doom empires. Heroes don't get millions of people killed pursuing fantasies. Heroes don't commit genocide and then blame their victims. Heroes don't flee when the consequences of their decisions come due. Enver Pasha wasn't a hero. He was a cautionary tale wearing a general's uniform. And the Ottoman Empire, 6 centuries of history, culture, achievement, and yes, plenty of brutality and oppression too, because empires are complicated, ended because nobody stopped him from making one terrible decision after another until there was nothing left to save. The empire that had once made Europe tremble, that had preserved classical knowledge through the Dark Ages, that had created architectural wonders like the Blue Mosque and the Süleymaniye, that had governed millions of people across 3 continents. Gone. Replaced by nation-states with artificial borders, unresolved ethnic tensions, and wounds that still bleed a century later. All because one man thought he knew better than everyone else. All because nobody could stop him. All because an empire betting everything on one terrible decision. The Ottoman Empire didn't fall to a superior enemy. It didn't collapse from internal decay alone. It was killed by its own leadership's hubris, by Enver Pasha's delusions of grandeur, by a system that concentrated too much power in the hands of someone who had no business wielding it. That's the real story. That's the crazy mistake. And if you think it couldn't happen again, if you think modern nations are too sophisticated, too democratic, too advanced to make similar mistakes, well, history would like to have a word with you about that assumption. Because the thing about catastrophic mistakes, they never look catastrophic when they're being made. They always look bold, decisive, necessary at the time. It's only afterward, when the bodies are counted and the empires have fallen and the consequences play out across generations, that everyone looks back and asks, how did we let this happen? The answer is always the same, one decision at a time, each one seeming reasonable in isolation, until suddenly you've walked off a cliff and it's too late to turn back. That's how you end an empire. That's the crazy mistake. And that's how 6 centuries of Ottoman history ended. Not with glory, but with the kind of failure that should be studied by every person who ever holds power and thinks they can't possibly make a mistake that big. Because they can, and if we're not careful, they will. So there you have it, the story of how one man's ambition and a cascade of catastrophically bad decisions brought down an empire that had stood for 600 years. If this story made you think differently about leadership, power, and the consequences of hubris, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you know someone who needs to hear this cautionary tale about what happens when ego overrides wisdom, share this with them. Thanks for watching, and remember, history isn't just something that happened. It's something we're still living with every single day.